Very happy to be joined on the show now by Mike Prysner, who's a producer for the Empire Files. Mike, thank you so much for being with us.
Happy to be here, y'all.
Very happy to have you. First, I actually want to get your thoughts on something we talked about a little bit earlier, which is the role of the media and the aftermath of the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. There's a couple different elements to it. One, there's just the element of the amount of pro-war voices that have emerged. Two, there's the element of, I saw the Washington Post and their editorial basically said we should continue occupying them forever. And just this sort of, even people who don't go that far, just sort of, I hate to call it soft, but sort of pro-war-ish propaganda, even if they're not necessarily going as far as the Post did. The ability of the media to push this out, it honestly reminded me of right before the war in Afghanistan more than anything else, just this flood of propaganda that seems in many ways untethered from reality, Mike.
Yeah, well, first off, the Afghanistan war was largely ignored by the mass media for most of the duration of the war. Of course, there was different peaks where all of a sudden they'd be covering it again for certain events like the troop surge, the end of the surge, and so forth, the dropping of the Moab. But for the most part, it stayed out of the headlines because, not enough soldiers were dying. It didn't matter that a lot of Afghans were dying, but not enough soldiers were dying to justify it getting any kind of media coverage like the Iraq war did during the worst years of the Iraq war. But, it was kind of an illuminating experience the past week of media coverage, because I think most people, including myself, often think of the mass media as really stenographers for the Pentagon. Whatever the Pentagon generals are putting out, whatever the foreign policy establishment is putting out, that's regurgitated by the mass media. But that didn't exactly happen over the past week, because the Afghanistan withdrawal is the Pentagon's plan. It's what the Pentagon wanted, it's what the Pentagon planned for, what the Pentagon negotiated, and what the Pentagon itself executed on the ground. So I ended up understanding the mass media, the corporate media, as just cheerleaders for the Pentagon. They're really just cheerleaders for war. Because when the Pentagon decided to wrap up one of its lost wars, it got more backlash than I've ever seen a Pentagon plan get from the media for ending a war and drawing it to a close. So, of course, there's an easy explanation for that, being that the media is kind of the mouthpiece, not so much for the state, but for the interests of the ruling class and specific sectors of the ruling class. One of those most powerful sectors, of course, is the defense industry and the energy industry. People that lost out a bit with the Afghanistan war ending. There's not a constant, endless flow of mine-resistant vehicles and missiles and so forth that were just being dumped on Afghanistan year after year. And so there's probably some nervousness from those who need to make more quarterly profits this quarter than the last quarter in the defense industry and in the energy industry, that now have a kind of source of endless spending dried up and are, wanting to put this pressure on the White House and on the Pentagon so that they get guarantees that, well, there's going to be bigger contracts because we're going to be needing to drop bombs somewhere else or building more vehicles to place in some other country.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, don't worry, guys. Don't worry. We got the Cold War with China. There's plenty of contracts coming your way. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, no, even in Biden's speech where he had to go up and defend the withdrawal, and his, when he was under a lot of fire because, he obviously completely botched the withdrawal operation. That was just an absolute catastrophe and horror to see human beings falling from the C-17s that were leaving. That was obviously a huge screw up by the military, the U.S. officers there and by the White House to allow that just dehumanizing chaos to happen. But when Biden had to, go and kind of cover up for the debacle and reinforce the fact that they truly were going to be leaving Afghanistan, he had to say, but this is because we have other battles to fight. He said Somalia, he said Yemen, he said Syria, he alluded to China. And so, it was almost like saying to them, no, we need to focus on war elsewhere rather than the war. So even in his speech about ending a war and holding strong to ending a war, he had to make these assurances that we were still committed to war elsewhere. Who is that for? Do the average Americans really care? Oh, no, we're not going to be at war.
It seems to me with Afghanistan that, like you were mentioning, the war in Afghanistan was just this massive racket, right? Where all of these contracts were being handed out. Lots of money was made by America's local partners who they kind of like put in charge of carrying out their mission at certain points, as well as American contractors. And I think it came to the point where, the people that were making the money versus the actual like US empire were clashing because the US empire had no geostrategic reason to be in Afghanistan anymore. But to that end, I want to go back here and I think it's important because this has been missing from all of the coverage of Afghanistan in the mainstream media, of course, which is like we pretend it started in 2001. But Afghanistan did not start in 2001. I mean, that's when we think of it because that's when the US invaded and occupied. But the reason it invaded and occupied was what? Al-Qaeda, the Taliban. Why aren't we ever talking about where these groups came from? And so I'd like for you to give a brief overview, Mike, because you've done this before and you've done it well, of that history of the 1979, which is when the US actually started to destroy Afghanistan, and why and how did the Taliban and Al-Qaeda come out of that?
Yeah, well, I think Afghanistan today, in particular by the media that wants to paint the United States as saviors to bring about human rights, women's rights, progress in Afghanistan, which 20 years as an occupying force have zero examples of actually doing that. It makes it seem as though Afghanistan has never had that in their history and among their population. When mass movements for women's rights, for socialism, for equality, and for labor rights, and all of these things were strong and vibrant. I mean, very much a part of Afghanistan's fabric. And not just that, but contributions to art and culture, literature, poetry, things like that. I mean, it's such a vibrant and important contribution to world culture. And politics, left-wing politics and progressive politics were very much a part of that and advancing. And it was specifically that the United States first intervened in Afghanistan to destroy. And of course, to create a state of war, to create a state of civil war, to provoke the Soviet Union to invading, to create, the Soviet Vietnam, intentionally to plunge the country into a state of endless war, precisely to just kind of meet the foreign policy, like the hegemonic goals of U.S. imperialism. And so, of course, that, led, that long, period of war set the stage for the situation that the U.S. said they had to intervene in. I mean, it's, of course, a lot of history there, but I think that whenever we hear this rhetoric of, we need to go help people because women's rights are bad. I mean, we're seeing it so much with Afghanistan. It's always talked about in like a complete historical vacuum. They only want you to look at this one place and say, if only the U.S. was able to intervene or exert its values, as they call it, in this place, we can establish a progress. We can establish human rights and women's rights. But there's a lot of example. Is there actually any example of the U.S. ever doing that anywhere with a military intervention or a coup or any intervention? I mean, there was lots of examples of U.S. military interventions. In fact, there are dozens and dozens just since World War II that you could point to. And what is the experience of all of those U.S. military interventions? Well, in all of them, human rights get set back. Women's rights get set back. I mean, it's a catastrophe. I mean, you don't even have to look in the distant history of decades ago, but just look at the Iraq War. I mean, the status of women in Iraq prior to the U.S. invasion was very good. And then now it has been set back really generations precisely because of the U.S. invasion and occupation. And so to kind of have this, want people to have a complete historical ignorance, to treat these things as like just hypotheticals. Well, maybe we could create the situation when there is just like an endless track record of U.S. intervention and what it does to the country and how it sets it on a path backwards from where it is and becomes the main barrier to anything ever moving forward in the country.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And to me, it's really one of the things that gets, I mean, I hate to say that it seems obvious, but it's as if people think that there are no consequences for imperialism. I mean, they look and they say, oh, well, this looks so terrible. Well, what did you expect? I mean, you go in, you completely destroy the country, you build up an unbelievably corrupt And we know, I mean, it's not that we don't even know these things are going on. I mean, it's very clear. I think anyone who's been paying attention to Afghanistan for the past 3 years, the Taliban has been taking more and more territory. It's not as if this is randomly happening. And then people in the media, it's like, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. What's going on? You know, you had Frederick Kagan in the New York Times. Oh, he could have won, but he didn't, which reminds me of that terrible Max Boot book, the Small Wars book, where he's like, we could have won Vietnam, but we didn't. Even almost the
Max
ties to
Boot.
the Saigon thing. I mean, that to me is deep, because it's almost like they're
That's
saying,
offensive to the
yeah,
North
like we never should have
Vietnamese.
left Vietnam either. And I mean, it's certainly, I agree with you, Rania. It's, I mean, the Taliban compared to the People's Army
It's
volunteers
not right.
of
No.
Vietnam, the People's Army of Vietnam.
That was
no
the good
connection.
guys actually winning.
Yeah, and there was also, by the way, op-ed in the New York Times today, sort of making this parallel, not directly. It was by the guy who wrote The Defector, which is an interesting book in and of itself, but you know, making the same kind of parallel, like, well, maybe we doing the right thing in Vietnam. I mean, it's all this sort of soft pro-imperialism that even if it didn't work out, you know, we kind of had the right move. And I feel like that's so much of what's happening now, is that there's so much, you know, faux surprise amongst politicians, in the media, as if somehow this was not, in many ways, a predictable set of consequences when you look at both the goals and the way this thing has been carried out.
I also want to add to that before we get Mike's take that, you know, Mike, you mentioned when you first came on that one of the reasons Afghanistan wasn't getting so much attention was because American soldiers weren't dying. And that wasn't by accident, because over the last few years under Trump, when his team, particularly Zalmay Khalilzad, was negotiating this ultimate withdrawal from Afghanistan, the negotiations were completely sidestepping and undermining the government the U.S. had been propping up for 20 years and going directly to the Taliban and essentially saying to them, look, you can attack Afghan forces, you just can't attack us. Right. And that's exactly what they did. So this is what actually I found very offensive about Joe Biden's speech after the big debacle in Kabul, was the way he blamed it on Afghans, the way he said, well, we can't fight and die in a war that Afghans aren't even willing to fight and die for. Actually, they have been fighting and dying for your stupid war in the tens of thousands. Like, and so much so, it's like an unsustainable level of dying for any force that seeks to be the security forces of a country. And furthermore, you know, I actually think there's an argument to be made that, of course, Ashraf Ghani is a terrible person and he, you know, fled because he has a foreign passport and he's awful. But as for the Afghan forces in the country, especially in Kabul, and how Joe Biden said, oh, they weren't willing to fight. Well, actually, one could look at it as they avoided bloodshed, because had they fought, there would have been a civil war right now. There would have been a catastrophe, a catastrophic loss of life in major cities across Afghanistan, had they chosen to take their weapons and actually fight the Taliban. So in many respects, what did happen is actually because the U.S. handed the country over to the Taliban and had this, you know, created this government and these security forces that were so dependent on American firepower that once the U.S. left, they like couldn't really do much. Because that's the situation that the U.S. created, one could say that the Afghan forces actually made the best decision here for the people in these cities.
Yeah, the best decision if you don't want to die fighting a battle that you know you're bound to lose. I mean, it just shows kind of the people that wield so much control over how many people will live or die. I mean, the politicians in Washington who decide to make war and decide if there's going to be more soldiers, where we're going to bomb, whatever. The idea that the people that have the power to make those decisions, that decide life and death for millions of people, populations of millions of people, that their logic was just, oh, well, the Afghan army has 300,000 soldiers and the Taliban have like 75,000 soldiers. So the math works out. Like, of course, Afghanistan's not going to fall to the Taliban. And they're just lying completely on this outside of any context in the country. I mean, one of them, of course, as you mentioned, was the fact that the puppet forces set up by the United States were just, when you have puppet forces, they're completely dependent on the puppet master. And so why did the Taliban, how is the Taliban able to take over every provincial capital in the matter of a week, really just walking right in? It's because as part of the U.S. withdrawal deal, they said they would stop doing the airstrikes. Of course, there were some residual airstrikes, like the B-52 bomber that Biden had to prevent the Taliban takeover of a single city for like 3 more days. He did this bombing and killed over 20 civilians, committing war crimes like bombing a school, bombing a medical clinic. A great encapsulation of the senseless violence, doing this bombing on a civilian population just to prevent the takeover of a city for like 3 more days, like maybe to make the media coverage stay in the way that he wanted it. But once you had the elimination of U.S. airstrikes, the Taliban could just walk into these cities. And why would the Afghan forces, which, of course, as you mentioned, Rania, were sustaining a huge number of casualties in fighting with the Taliban, like a lot. And, nobody really wants to be in a losing battle. And so if they were taking a lot of casualties with U.S. air support that was coming in and just leveling in the areas where Taliban fighters were around them, as soon as you lose that air support, and you know that you have a good chance that you're probably going to lose the battle and be completely overrun, killed, and captured by the Taliban. And then you have, Ashraf Ghani fleeing the country. I think that surprised a lot of Americans, but I guarantee you that didn't surprise any Afghan soldiers. I mean, so the idea that you would kind of fight and die for a government that was just probably going to leave with millions of dollars anyway, over $100 million actually. It's no surprise that they collapsed so quickly. But the other piece that I think is maybe the bigger one, that the Pentagon thinking, oh, they got 300,000 soldiers, why wouldn't they fight to stop the Taliban from taking over Kabul? One thing that the Pentagon can't really wrap their mind around, the Pentagon, which just loves war, is that maybe the Afghan soldiers didn't want to be at war anymore. And maybe that they saw the Taliban insurgency and the other many different militias and stuff that affiliated with them and were fighting occupation forces and Afghan puppet forces, that maybe they saw them as their countrymen, that they had some shared culture, shared religion, some commonality, and that they didn't actually want to fight them anymore. And they wanted to cooperate and have peace. I think that you can go and look up in 2018, there was a ceasefire between the Afghan army and the Taliban for many weeks. And what happened in this ceasefire? You had the Taliban come into these city centers and they celebrated Eid with the Afghan army. There's all these photos of Taliban and Afghan army people holding hands, dancing together, eating together. I mean, there was almost like celebrations in the streets throughout Afghanistan because these people who were from the same country being forced to fight each other, the reason that they were having to fight each other was because the existence of this NATO occupation. And that was really the barrier to the fighting stopping. And so for the U.S., a civil war was very much in their interest. And we're already seeing the United States, I think they're going to gauge how friendly the Taliban government is going to be. If the Taliban government is going to be friendly to Western interests, allowing business contracts and collaborating on counterterrorism and all the things that they asked for in this deal, that you'll see the U.S. kind of very quickly develop friendly relations with the Afghan government. But if the Taliban government appear like they were in the 90s as uncooperative, as barriers, as favoring relations with China and Russia over the United States, then you will very much see not only kind of economic pressure through sanctions, seizing money from the banks and things like that, but putting money into funding civil conflict in the country, forces that oppose the Taliban, pouring money and weapons into them to kind of create, a state of war artificially through foreign intervention, just as the last 20 years have been.
Shout out to Animosity. Threw $20 there into the super chat. No comment, just donating, and I appreciate that. I mean, I guess it does bring me to another point, though, Mike, and just the way we think about this. I mean, to me, they were never winning, the United States, right? I mean, they were really just forestalling the inevitable. I mean, there have been so many articles over the years about, what was really going on in Afghanistan and what was happening. You've got places that are allegedly controlled by the government, but then, at night, the Taliban was coming in and running their own judicial system. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I think this is not rare. I mean, this is actually common when you look at military occupations like this. The same thing is true in the Sahel, in Africa, certainly. The same thing was true in Vietnam, where you can use a certain set of presence in urban areas to create the illusion that you have a viable political project rather than a colonial occupation. And for years, they've really just been forestalling the inevitable. I mean, I think that's why so many people have been frustrated about the ongoing nature of the war, because you can see the money going out, you can see the tens of thousands of people who are dying, you can see the massive spike in heroin being sold, because people forget that. I remember we were also supposed to be taking out the poppy seeds, but of course now it's higher than it's ever been, that to some degree there has been, and I think this was in the Afghanistan papers, Douglas Lute, the general, basically saying we didn't know what we were doing. We had no idea what was going on. We were just doing whatever. And I feel like there's been this new fiction created that, like, at some point, you know, we really had them going. You know, we really had them on the run, rather than really just having had a status quo of extreme violence that was only maintained by extreme violence. And to me, that's why it collapsed so quickly, because it was always a very hollow construct.
Yeah, well, the point in the Afghanistan war where the U.S. like really tried to win was the troop surge under Obama, and that was just a complete and utter disaster, a total defeat of U.S. forces on the ground, which is a big history to get into. But you know, places like Korangal Valley, Wenat Valley are really emblematic of that phase of just small U.S. positions, just basically holding themselves off from being completely overrun by lots of Taliban fighters on a daily basis, and only being saved through the massive air support that the U.S. was able to fly in to prevent these bases from being overrun. But extreme high number of casualties during the surge. You know, I think that you're right. The Afghanistan papers are definitely the most important chapter of the Afghanistan war, because it revealed that for most of the duration of the war, behind the scenes, there is a complete acknowledgement that the U.S. had lost militarily and could not win. And then when they found themselves in a state of military defeat, instead of admitting defeat and leaving, like would be the right thing to, or the sane thing to do, and not only did they not do that, but they didn't even develop. I mean, if you care about like, if anyone who cares about like, oh, maybe we should have tried harder to win, they didn't even like come up with a way to win. They were just, it was fine for them to drag on. Generals switch out every few months. You know, no commander really has to take responsibility. And so you're right. The revelation of the Afghanistan paper was they were internally saying like, yeah, we don't even have a strategy anymore. We're just kind of like here and going through the motions. And that characterized most of the war, which was fine for them, because the generals cycle in and out of the base in Afghanistan. They get, you know, just for sitting on a main base in Kabul, they'll get, you know, a silver star or some medal for valor pinned on their chest. They'll get a couple extra stripes on their uniform for combat experience, even though they just sat back on a main base and probably never put on a body armor or a helmet. And then all of that adds to their resume. So when they get out of the military, you know, and then, you know, take a week vacation and then go straight to becoming an executive or a lobbyist or a member of a corporate board for the same defense industries that they gave contracts to when they were in the Pentagon, you know, making 6, sometimes 7-figure salaries based on how much command experience they have in battle. So it's great for them to go to Iraq and Afghanistan a bunch of times. You know, there was no incentive for them to end it, because, you know, generals weren't going on patrols where people were getting their legs blown off every day. You know, they weren't having to deal with any of that. And the politicians in Washington, it was the same thing. And it's good to have a big excuse for a big military budget. They're making their the defense industry happy and all of that stuff. So there is no, even from that standpoint of inside the establishment, a complete acknowledgement that not only were we losing, but weren't even trying to figure out some kind of solution. They were happy to just drag it out. It was great for the military-industrial complex. It was great for the military, which got to just vastly expand its technological arsenal. And there was no pressure on them because, of course, there were Americans dying, but not enough for it to be a scandal like it was during the troop surge or the height of the Iraq war. And, you know, I don't think that they expected that. I mean, I think there was a lot of speculation that the U.S. wanted to get into an endless quagmire because it was good for the military-industrial complex. I think that they made the best out of the situation that they were handed for the MIC, for capitalism. But they actually thought it was going to be easy. And if you look back at wars of the U.S. over the past, 40 or 50 years, you had the major defeat in Korea, you had the major defeat in Vietnam, but then there's this period prior to 9/11 where the U.S. has all these small interventions. They're in Panama, they're in Grenada, they're doing these little overthrows. There's not a lot of U.S. casualties. They accomplished their mission. You had the Gulf War, which was like the next big war that the U.S. waged in the 90s, where you had a big, large invasion of like 100,000 American troops. almost no American soldiers died at the hands of Iraqi forces. All the soldiers that died were killed by American forces that accidentally killed them, over 100 or so. And so in the consciousness of the commanders in the Pentagon, losing Korea, that was so far in the past. And they thought, now our military is so technologically advanced. We have precision-guided missiles. We have night vision goggles. We have armored vehicles. We have so many things that we are invincible in battle. And if we roll into Afghanistan, if we roll into Iraq, of course we're going to win the war. The Taliban is no match for us. The Iraqi army is no match for us. And they just arrogantly thought they could stroll into these countries, quickly overthrow the government, set up a puppet government, and just through their military prowess, prevent anyone from challenging that. And they were going to move on to Iran and Lebanon and Syria and all these other countries where they wanted regime change and thought they could do it through brute military force. And they did not anticipate the reality that people don't want to live under foreign occupation, which is kind of like the most common sense thing there is. I mean, if you asked any American, for the most part, what they would do if a foreign army invaded and was occupying their neighborhood, a vast majority of them, I would say, they'd take the gun out of their closet and start shooting at them. And so just the sheer arrogance that they thought that they could do this without any kind of resistance. And then that led to them being dealt 2 military defeats in 2 countries that had vastly inferior technological capacity, even less people to fight. And it just kind of, that was the result of just kind of hubris and arrogance of couple rich politicians and a handful of generals who just, took their uniform off and then put on a suit and then went to making 7-figure salaries.
Yeah, that's right. The revolving door is, one element of this it's really the element of every aspect of the government, but a really disgusting one, I think, when you see they launder their reputations. And the ones that don't go into the private sector then go into academia. I remember when David Petraeus was, briefly at CUNY. I think he actually might be at Yale now. And I think it was in the Yale class, they actually banned people taking notes because they didn't want, and they were checking people for recorders and all these other things because, I think they probably had a sense that people might challenge him in the class and or maybe he'd let something slip, but they didn't want to have an actual back and forth between these students and these generals and have someone record it and then have it come out, with what these people are really thinking. And of course, we know Petraeus being one of these people. And one thing I just want to say really quickly, I'm really glad you made the point about the technological piece, Mike, because I think one thing that we've almost forgotten, they invented this new robot warfare. We call it drone warfare now, but they really invented this whole new form of extremely destructive and even more impersonal and thus some might say easier to carry out, although I think we see drone pilots are facing, quite a bit of PTSD and the like, but, almost this video game-like thing. But now this whole robot warfare of drones has spread around the entire world, and the rules of engagement, which we can go anywhere and kill anyone at any time, have been adopted by many other countries. And I think that is a notable factor of this, is that they really did develop a whole new arena and form of war out of this occupation in Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's another reason why dragging the war out was good for U.S. imperialism, because all of these extra funds, the top 5 defense contractors saw their government contracts quadruple as soon as the war on terror started. And today their government contracts those are still intact. They're not going to lose them because the war in Afghanistan has wrapped up. So there was this spigot of just an unlimited flow of American taxpayer dollars to go into the defense industry. This wasn't always for, we need this many trucks, we got to buy these trucks. It was so much was just for research and development, come up with new weapons. And it's such a racket. It's funny because if you were in the DC subway, you see ads in the DC subway for new pieces of military equipment, a new armored vehicle, a new tank. Who's buying a tank? Well, it's because the people who work in the Pentagon take the subway and they're like, that looks like a cool vehicle. I'm going to call those guys up, have them come give the presentation at the office. And then the company comes and they're like, cool. We'll give you $10 billion. Give us a bunch of these vehicles. And then that establishes a good relationship with that general who gave them the contract. And then it's a lasting relationship. They come on as a consultant later, as a lobbyist for the company, going to Congress and saying, hey, you know what, as a general, I worked with these people and they gave us this great vehicle, so here's why you should buy their product. I mean, it's a complete and total racket that only like accelerates militism around the world as like there's no ants, you know, like, oh, the US is going to develop this new generation of drones as if it's going to give it this advantage over the world, when then every other imperialist country is just going to be like, okay, you know, we're going to do the same thing. And then it's just like leads to this completely senseless arms race that, of course, the US is the center of. And yeah, you know, it's interesting that even with all of that, it just didn't matter on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. But it was fine for US corporations. Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna note that was what was amazing about the pullout is that the U.S. was such a debacle for them because their intelligence is so bad, because the intelligence community doesn't actually know anything. They don't know what's happening on the ground in Afghanistan. They were like, I mean, the predictions were like, they were like, we predict in 3 months the Taliban will take most of the country. Then it was like, we predict in 30 days and now we're rushing to get our staff out. And 4 days later, the Taliban took Kabul. And it really makes you realize like they don't know what's happening on the ground in Syria or Iraq or any of these other countries either. Most actually part of that is probably because not that they ever really knew, but part of it is also because of this dependent on this like robot warfare technology now, where you're like gathering intelligence with drones. Like that's what a lot of the US military apparatus does now. So yeah, they don't know what's going on anywhere, which is actually kind of soothing to my soul in a way.
Yeah, no, military intelligence is the biggest oxymoron. It's a saying in the military. And you know, it has historical precedent. I mean, there's a reason why so many officers were killed by their own soldiers in the Vietnam War. It's because they were the brains behind the operation, and they sucked. And that's part of a legacy of the Afghanistan war too. Is there was, even though it didn't manifest in the same way as it did for in the Iraq War, where you had hundreds of soldiers who were refusing to fight in Iraq and becoming anti-war activists. Like had a different character in the Afghanistan war. But there was, even though it didn't manifest as political action, there was so much discontent among the rank and file soldiers in the Afghanistan war because they could see clearly that their commanders, even down to like the lower levels, like company levels, the officers that were running everything had no idea what they were doing. And that's why a lot of people were dying on both sides. And it was just kind of like one of the characteristic pieces of history of the Afghanistan war is the soldiers that were sent out, out to be in the middle of nowhere or back on the bases doing training. It was obvious to them that those at the top didn't know what they were doing, getting a lot of people killed for absolutely no reason. And so you see there were all these little acts of rebellion from like true believer soldiers who like joined after 9/11 to go to Afghanistan to fight the Taliban, and then got there and like had different ways of speaking out and trying to draw attention to the situation so that the war would end. Many of them didn't survive. People that came out publicly on the record talking about how all these patrols are completely pointless. We're killing people and getting people their legs blown off every single day for absolutely no reason, except these generals want to say, hey, look, we've got some dots on a map. That's where our soldiers are. We're winning the war. Look at all the provinces that we occupy. Those people coming out and blowing the whistle on it to Congress and things like that. And then a week later, getting blown up by an IED themselves and killed. So, that's an important piece of the thing also. Even like the everyone remembers this Bo Bergdahl thing where like the soldier fled and was captured by the Taliban and there's this prisoner, all that stuff. A piece of that story that's missing is why Bo Bergdahl left his base and ended up being captured by the Taliban is because it was like an act of protest. He was trying to trigger this big scandal that let the higher leadership know that there was just complete debacle on the ground where they were, and it was just complete chaos because of the officers that were in charge of them. It was like a rebellion against the battalion and lower level commanders to try to get them all investigated by the higher command. And so, like I said, even though it didn't manifest as like anti-war activity, like soldiers who were in Iraq did, there are these very significant, rebellions and speaking out that happened throughout it, which of course will be left off the official record of the Afghanistan war.
Yeah, it just seems like the upshot of all of this, Mike, really is you know, the root of this issue is imperialism, that nothing good can come out of trying to control, occupy, and browbeat the world to follow what a handful of people on Wall Street and in Washington, D.C. want.
I was going to say, it depends which side you sit on, unless
That's
you're
fair.
like the weapons contractor
And the
and
Council
you're
for
like,
Foreign
I'm
Relations.
buying myself a new penthouse.
Yeah, sadly,
But yeah, no, it's actually disgusting. It's disgusting the level of wealth that was gained from so much destruction.
Yeah, and I think now that the war has an end cap, you know, now that it can be wrapped up, it's bookended, you could look at it in its entirety, 2001 to 2021, what happened? And the same way we can look at the Iraq war. You know, of course, the Iraq war continues in some form, but the real American occupation of Iraq, and the period of counterinsurgency or whatever, I mean, we can look at those two pieces of history as complete pictures. And I hope that really gets remembered for people, especially people who think about joining the military or have family that think about joining the military, or who are in the military and are going to be called up when the U.S. decides to go to war with someone else. Because now that we have these wars bookended and wrapped up in some capacity, we can see a pattern and experience of what this government does. You know, this government that cares to claim so much about people around the world, and of course its own soldiers. I mean, it's such a piece of American culture of like worshiping members of the military. You know, like these politicians, I mean, they get their photo taken at veteran cemeteries every year. I mean, it's such a part of like the propaganda, is that the politicians like love their soldiers so much. But what was the overall experience of the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war? We know now that, number one, they will lie about why we're going, and we'll just lie to you about why we have to invade these countries. What they acknowledge privately and what they say to the public is completely different. So they will lie to you about why we have to go. All of their, number two, is all their rhetoric about bringing human rights and we're doing this because we care about the people that we're going to save. In fact, they will unleash extreme brutality, commit an endless list of war crimes, subject people to humiliating occupation. So anyone who thinks that you're going to be going and helping people, you'll be doing the exact opposite. You know, and then when the war starts going badly for them, like it did with Iraq, like with Afghanistan, when it turns out that it blew up in their face and shows that they didn't know what they were getting into and it turned into a disaster, what are they going to do then? Are they going to say, oh, this turned into a disaster, let's stop more people from dying and get out of there? No, they'll lie and just throw more and more bodies into the meat grinder, so even more people die, simply because they don't want to take responsibility for a failure. They're just going to dump more bodies into it because it's not their kids, it's not their neighbors. Then the people that are affected by the war, and we saw this clearly with the Kabul airport tarmac, but even with their own soldiers, the people that they send to the war, that they send into the meat grinder, when they need help, they throw them away like a piece of garbage. That's why you saw what happened to the people in Afghanistan right now. And soldiers came back to a suicide epidemic where the government said, you know what, we're actually going to punish you if you try to seek mental health care, and we're going to send you back to Iraq and Afghanistan a bunch of times. And if you kill yourself, you know, that's your fault. You know, the skyrocketing rate of veterans homelessness. And so these politicians that they say they care so much about you, and the people of the countries they're going to invade and occupy, treat them all like garbage as soon as they're done using them. And so all while that's happening, these small group of people at the top are making a really lavish amount of money, super profits off of the war. It's easy for them to drag it out. And then all of the people that were your commanders, they're going to do okay also, because they're going to go making, you know, like, as we said, go make a few $1 million just, you know, hawking the different products that these companies make with their, you know, medals for valor that they got on those main big bases where they were in no danger at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mike, I really appreciate you coming on. Obviously, there's so much, we could talk so much about this. We're going to continue to have to keep talking about this. Obviously, it's an important piece of news and important lessons that we need to learn, but really appreciate everything you all do on the Empire Files as well. So thanks for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Of course. Keep up the great work.
Thank you.